On a lonely pass where dust meets sky, a father cast off his daughter as though she were no more than a burden. Her hands trembled against her belly, her future stripped bare, and the only home awaiting her was a cabin in the mountains. And a man she had never met. Within those log walls, silence ruled. He was a man who spoke little, who carried his grief in scars and shadows. She, abandoned and unwanted, felt the weight of being given away like cattle. Yet in the stillness of the fire's glow, something unspoken began to stir. Then came the storm, and with it a stranger on the edge of death. She expected violence. She expected rejection. But instead she saw him open his door, binding wounds with steady hands, standing like a shield against the storm. For the first time, she wondered if kindness could be fiercer than cruelty. The wagon creaked as it climbed the narrow mountain road, each turn of the wheel grinding against stone and mud. The young woman sat hunched in the back, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, though the cloth had long since lost its warmth. It smelled of horses, of dust, and faintly of her father's sweat, a bitter reminder of the man who sat rigid on the driver's bench, his hands hard on the reins. She did not speak. She had learned silence on this journey, just as she had learned to keep her eyes on the horizon rather than on the man beside her. He had not touched her except to help her up onto the wagon at dawn, and even then, his grip had been like iron, not of care, but of cold resolve. He had not once called her by name since they left town. The mountains rose higher with each mile, their peaks touched with the last dustings of winter snow. Pines leaned heavy over the road, their shadows stretching, like bars across the mud. Somewhere water ran, a creek tumbling through stone, its voice sharper than either of theirs. When the cabin came into view, it was sudden, as though it had been waiting behind the trees. Smoke lifted thin from its chimney, a single ribbon against the pale sky. The man who stood outside it was broad of shoulder, his hair bound in a rough braid that hung over one side. He leaned on an axe, the ground around him littered with fresh split wood. He looked up at the wagon without expression. Her father reined the horses to a stop. For a long moment, the only sound was their labored breath and the soft pop of the cabin's chimney fire. Then her father climbed down, boots crunching in the gravel. "She's yours now," he said flatly, without ceremony. The words struck her like a blow, though they were no surprise. She had heard them in his tone the entire journey, felt them in the sharp set of his jaw. Still, hearing them aloud stripped her of the last thin hope that he might change his mind. She swallowed hard, keeping her eyes on her lap. The mountain man, Elias, she would later learn, straightened from his axe. He wiped his hands against his trousers but made no move toward her. His face was weathered, not with cruelty, but with years of weather and solitude. His eyes lingered on her father, then shifted to her, though not in the way of men in town who had looked at her belly with judgment or hunger. His gaze was measuring, steady, like a man sizing the strength of a storm. Her father turned back to the wagon and thrust his hand toward her. "Up." Her legs shook as she obeyed. The ground felt unsteady when she stepped onto it, though the earth beneath her boots was solid. Her father pressed the shawl tighter around her shoulders as if closing her in one last time, but there was no tenderness in the gesture. Only finality. "You made your bed," he muttered low, though loud enough for Elias to hear. "Now you'll lie in it. Don't come looking for me, don't send word. You're done with my name." And with that he turned, climbed back onto the wagon, and snapped the reins. The horses moved with a jolt. She stood frozen as the wheels rolled past, mud flinging against her skirts. Her father did not look back. Dust rose in their wake, curling into the air before settling heavy on her tongue. When the sound of the wagon faded, silence swallowed the clearing. Only the wind moved, stirring the pines. Elias's voice came at last, rough and low. "Come inside." She hesitated, but there was no other road, no wagon to carry her back. She followed him to the cabin, her boots dragging through pine needles. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, resin, and something boiled, beans perhaps, or stew left long on the fire. The walls were made of heavy timbers, dark with age, and the single room was spare. A bed against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, a rocking chair by the hearth. A rifle leaned in the corner. Everything had a place and nothing more than what was needed. Elias set down the axe and hung his coat on a peg. Without speaking, he moved to the hearth, stirred the embers, and set on another log. The fire brightened, casting light across the floor. He poured coffee from a blackened pot and set the tin cup on the table. "Sit," he said. She obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair as though she might break it. The coffee was bitter, strong enough to make her chest ache, but its heat steadied her trembling hands. Elias busied himself with small tasks, removing his boots, hanging a kettle by the fire. He neither questioned her nor studied her, and in that silence she felt her own shame swell larger. In town, whispers had followed her like wolves. Here in the hush of the mountains there was no whispering, only the weight of what her father had done, what she had lost. That night she lay on a narrow cot he pulled from the corner, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of pine smoke and damp wool. Elias sat in the rocking chair by the fire, the wood creaking in slow rhythm. He said nothing, only rocked, the shadows of the flames moving across his face. Her father's voice lingered in her ears, sharp and final. "She's yours." Now, tears threatened, but she bit them back. She would not cry here, not in front of this stranger who owed her nothing. The fire cracked, the chair creaked, and outside the wind pressed against the shutters like a thing trying to get in. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Only the knowledge that she had been given away like cattle and that this cabin, this man, this silence was all she had left. Tone and realization, bleak, stripped of hope. She understands with aching clarity that her father has abandoned her, not just from his household, but from the very life she once believed she belonged to. Elias, though silent and severe, reveals himself not as cruel, but as a man who carries his own kind of restraint. The days slipped into one another with the rhythm of chores and silence. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, pale and cold, touching the floorboards in a slow crawl. She woke to the sound of Elias moving about, boots against the planks, the scrape of iron as he stoked the fire, the measured creak of the door when he stepped out to fetch wood or water. He spoke little, and she learned quickly that questions were met with silence unless they served a purpose. Yet silence was not absence. It was a language of its own, his movements deliberate, his gestures steady, his presence unyielding as the mountains themselves. She watched him when he did not see her watching. His hands, rough and scarred, bore stories she did not know. A long mark crossed the back of his right hand, pale against sun-browned skin as though once torn by blade or beast. His rifle, polished and cared for, bore grooves along the stock where his grip had worn the wood smooth. He tied his hair back each morning with a strip of leather, a single braid falling over one shoulder like a mark of stubborn order against the wilderness. If she busied herself with sweeping the floor or scrubbing pots by the creek, he did not stop her, nor did he thank her. But there was no reproach in his silence, only a quiet acceptance that labor was simply life. In odd moments, she glimpsed pieces of his past as though the cabin itself could not help but speak of him. One afternoon, while searching for a shawl in the cedar chest, her hand brushed against fabric different from the rest. She drew it out carefully. A dress, yellowed with years, trimmed with lace that had once been fine. A wedding dress, folded, with care, still carrying the faint scent of cedar and old flowers. Her breath caught, and she replaced it quickly, shutting the lid as though she had trespassed. The rocking chair by the fire spoke of someone else too. Its seat was half broken, one arm carved with initials she could not make out in the dim firelight. Elias never sat in it. He always chose the plain wooden chair or the stool, leaving the rocking chair to stand like a sentinel to memory. It was only later, when she followed the path behind the cabin, that she found the stones. 3 of them, small and unmarked, pressed into the soil with careful hands. The ground around them was kept neat, pine needles brushed aside, though no flowers grew there. She did not need names to understand. The silence of the graves told her everything, that Elias had once been husband, perhaps father, and had been left alone with ghosts that never spoke but never departed. In that discovery, her shame grew heavier. She thought of her father's hard eyes when he cast her away, of the whispers that had chased her through town like fire through dry grass. She ruined herself, they had said. She made her bed. The man who had once promised her the world had left at the first word of her condition, slipping away in the night without a backward glance. Her father had not beaten her. Abandonment was punishment enough. In the eyes of her kin, she was marked, no better than cattle given in trade. And now here she was, cast into the hands of a man who bore scars of his own. At night, when the fire burned low, she lay on her cot and listened to the sounds of the cabin. The groan of the timbers in the wind, the crackle of settling coals, Elias shifting in his bed as though chased even in dreams. She touched her belly with both hands, wondering if the child within her would be born into silence as deep as this. She wanted to believe she was more than a punishment, but the voices of the past clung to her, whispering that she was nothing more. One evening, while she sat mending a tear in her shawl by the fire, Elias spoke for the first time in days. His voice was rough from disuse. "You keep your hands busy." She startled at the sound, needle pausing mid-stitch. "It helps me think less," she admitted before she could stop herself. He nodded once, neither judging nor comforting. That's the way of it. Nothing more was said, but she held on to that small exchange, simple as it was. A thread in the silence, binding them not as strangers but as two souls who carried the weight of what was lost. Over time she began to see the symmetry between them. His scars were visible, etched on skin, carved into tools, set into the earth behind the cabin. Hers were hidden, born of shame and whispered judgment. Yet both had been abandoned, he by death, she by betrayal. The realization was not comfort, not yet, but it was recognition, a truth that whispered she was not entirely alone in her exile. She began to notice the way he moved around her, not close, not distant, but with a certain quiet respect. He never reached for her, never demanded her labor, never spoke of why she had come. In his silence there was no condemnation. That alone was a strange kind of mercy. The mountains pressed down with their endless quiet, and the days unfolded one after another. Yet beneath that silence something else lingered, an understanding that neither of them had chosen this life, but both must live it. And in the slow rhythm of firelight and work, she began to see Elias not as the punishment her father intended, but as a man marked by grief, walking a path not so different from her own. Tone and realization. Somber, reflective, and heavy with memory. The young woman recognizes that she is not the only one abandoned. Elias, too, has been cast into silence by loss. Their grief begins to mirror each other, forming the first fragile thread of kinship. The storm came without warning. Clouds gathered in the afternoon, low and dark, pressing against the mountain ridges like a weight too heavy for the sky to bear. By nightfall, the world was split by thunder that rolled as if the heavens themselves were at war. Rain beat hard against the roof, seeping through cracks in the shingles, dripping in slow trails down the walls. Inside, the fire hissed and spat as the wind forced smoke back down the chimney. Elias worked silently, shoving another log into the flames, while she sat at the table with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The cabin trembled at each burst of thunder. She thought the storm would be the worst of it, until the knock came. It was not polite, nor hesitant. It was the pounding of desperation, a fist striking the wooden door with the urgency of survival. Elias froze for only a moment before he reached for the rifle in the corner. His movements were quick but unhurried, the way of a man who had lived through enough storms of a different kind. He lifted the bar from the door with one hand and opened it with the other, rifle steady at his side. The figure that stumbled in was half collapsed already. A man, drenched from the storm, his hair plastered against his face. Blood ran from a gash along his arm. mixing with rainwater that dripped from his clothes and pooled onto the cabin floor. His features marked him plainly as one of the people who had lived in these mountains long before cabins or roads were cut into them. His chest rose and fell in harsh breaths, eyes wide, not with fear of Elias's rifle, but with the strain of running too far, too fast. For a heartbeat, the young woman thought Elias would cast him out. The world she knew had little mercy for men like this, and less still for those who harbored them. But Elias did not raise the rifle. Instead, he set it aside and stepped forward, catching the man beneath the arm before he could collapse entirely. "Sit," Elias said, guiding him to the stool by the fire. His voice carried no softness, but neither did it carry cruelty. The young woman rose without thinking, fetching a rag from the shelf and heating water over the flames. She moved by instinct, though. Her hands trembled as she laid out cloth and a strip of linen she had been saving for mending. Elias pressed a firm hand to the wound, stemming the bleeding with the ease of one who had done such work before. The stranger did not speak English, or if he did, he chose not to. His words came in another tongue, low and strained, spoken like prayers between breaths. Elias answered with silence, but there was understanding in the way he worked, wrapping, binding, securing the wound with care. She watched in awe and in fear. This was no ordinary act of kindness. This was a choice that could carry danger to them both. Men in town spoke of raids, of cattle gone missing, of arrows in fence posts. If they knew this stranger had been sheltered, Elias could pay dearly. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You made your bed. Lie in it." She had been given away because she was a burden, a shame. Now another outcast sat bleeding in the cabin, and Elias did not cast him aside. The storm outside howled as if trying to force its way in. Rain lashed the shutters, thunder shook the timbers, but inside Elias became the barrier, solid, steady, unflinching. He ladled broth into a tin cup and held it out. The stranger took it with shaking hands, drinking slowly. She studied Elias then, really studied him. His face was carved in shadows by the firelight, his expression calm even as danger, lingered close. He did not ask why the man had come, he did not demand gratitude. He simply did what needed to be done. Strength, she realized, was not always the crack of a whip or the sharpness of a curse. It was this, holding steady when the storm threatened to break down the walls. Hours passed, the storm raging on. The stranger dozed in the chair, his wound clean and bound, his breathing easier now. Elias checked the bandage once more before stepping back, folding his arms across his chest. His eyes shifted briefly toward her, meeting hers for the first time that night. There was no question in his gaze, no apology, only a quiet certainty. This was what must be done. She looked away quickly, heart pounding. Something had stirred inside, her that she could not name. A warmth, unfamiliar and frightening, rising beneath the weight of shame she had carried for so long. It was not hope, not yet, but it was something close to respect. The storm began to ease in the hours before dawn. Rain softened to a patter. Thunder retreated into the distance, leaving the cabin heavy with silence once more. The stranger still slept, his head resting against the back of the stool. Elias moved to the door and stood there a long while, watching the gray light creep into the trees. She remained by the fire, her shawl wrapped close, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to speak, to ask why he had risked so much for a man he did not know, but the words caught in her throat. Perhaps she already knew the answer. Elias lived by a code she did not yet understand, but she could feel its weight in the room. Unspoken, steady, merciful. It was not the law of townsfolk, nor the harsh judgment of fathers. It was something older, quieter and stronger than both. When he finally turned back from the door, his expression unchanged, she realized she no longer saw him as the jailer her father had made him out to be. He was something else entirely. Man bound by his own rules, who chose mercy even when it carried risk. And for the first time since she had been left at the cabin, She felt the faint stirring of a thought she had not dared let herself feel. Perhaps survival here did not mean enduring punishment. Perhaps it could mean something more. Tone and realization. Tense, but illuminating. The storm reveals Elias's unspoken code. Protection, not cruelty. In watching him risk shelter for a hunted man, she realizes strength can be silent, merciful, and steadfast. Her view of him shifts from punishment to protector, from stranger to someone she could begin to trust. The storm passed, but it left its weight behind. Days after, the air carried the damp smell of pine needles and wet soil, the mountains dripping with melt as streams carved new paths through stone. In the cabin, silence reclaimed its place, though it felt different than before, as if something unspoken had taken root between them during that long night. The stranger was gone by dawn, slipping into the forest as quietly as he had arrived. Elias had offered him food wrapped in cloth and pointed toward the ridge where the trail bent east. No words passed between them that she could understand, only a nod exchanged at the threshold, the kind of nod that carried both respect and farewell. Then Elias had barred the door again and said nothing more. Life resumed its rhythm, though the rhythm was no longer the same. She began to rise early, before the sun cleared the pines, and sweep the hearthstones until they gleamed with ash. Elias returned each morning with water balanced in the yoke across his shoulders, his boots wet with dew. They ate bread and beans in silence, the scrape of spoons against tin bowls marking the only sound between them. She noticed things she had not before, the way he bowed his head slightly before eating, lips moving in a prayer too soft to catch, the way he sat with shoulders squared but eyes lowered, as if the act of eating were both necessity and remembrance. At dusk, when the light slanted gold across the clearing, he would take a whetstone and sharpen his tools. The axe, the knife, the rifle. Each stroke was steady, deliberate, carrying the same quiet gravity as his prayers. She did not intrude. Instead, she found work that did not demand words, mending torn sleeves, patching blankets, stirring beans while they simmered slow in the kettle. It soothed her to create order in small things. Every morning she braided her hair, even when no one but Elias would see. She folded shawls and tucked them neat in the chest, lined up the cups and plates so they met evenly along the shelf. These little rituals gave her the dignity her father had stripped away. Elias noticed. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered a moment longer when she brushed past him to set a pot on the table, or in the faint hesitation before he took the cup she offered. He did not praise her, nor did he expect it of her. But in his silence she felt a recognition that steadied her more than words could have. Yet tension lingered, humming low beneath the surface. She felt it one evening when her hand slipped carrying a kettle too full and hot water threatened to splash across the floor. Elias reached quickly, steadying her wrist with his hand. His grip was firm, his palm calloused, and for a heartbeat he did not let go. She felt the warmth of his skin against hers, the strength in his hold, not claiming, not cruel, but undeniably present. When he released her, her pulse still echoed the memory of his touch. Another time she faltered while splitting kindling, the axe biting too shallow into the wood. Elias stood behind her, watching. Without a word, he stepped forward, laid his hand over hers and guided the axe in a single clean strike. The wood split easily. She looked up, expecting rebuke for her weakness, but his gaze was steady, calm. He stepped back without comment, leaving her with the lesson and the warmth of his nearness. At night, the fire cast shifting light across the cabin, and the silence between them grew heavier, though not in the way it once had. She lay awake on her cot, listening to the faint creak of his bed as he turned, the slow rhythm of his breath. Sometimes she thought she heard him murmur in his sleep, a name perhaps, or a prayer. She did not ask. Her fear lingered still, sharp as ever. Was she here out of pity, out of duty? Did he see her as a burden left by her father, no different than a stray mule abandoned at his gate? The shame gnawed at her, whispering that kindness was not the same as belonging. And yet, he too carried his ghosts. She saw it in the way his eyes lingered on the broken rocking chair, the one he never touched. She saw it in his stillness by the graves out back where he stood some evenings with his hat in his hands, shoulders bent under the weight of memory. Perhaps that was why he kept his distance. To offer her more than protection might feel like betrayal to the dead. Perhaps to reach for her would mean letting go of what he had once held dear. The truth lay unspoken between them, fragile as glass. Each day they lived beside one another, their silence laced with threads of something neither dared name. She felt it when his hand brushed hers in passing, or when his gaze held hers a heartbeat too long across the firelight. He felt it when she braided her hair each morning, a quiet act of resilience in a world that had tried to strip her bare. Desire and dignity coiled together, restrained by grief, by fear, by the uncertainty of what tomorrow might demand. But still it was there, alive beneath the roof like an ember hidden in ash. They said nothing of it. They could not. Yet in the quiet cabin, in the rhythm of shared work and fire-lit nights, both knew. Something had begun. Tone and realization, subtle, restrained, charged with quiet emotion. Neither speaks their longing, yet both feel it. An unspoken recognition that they are no longer strangers, nor punishment and jailer, but two people standing on the edge of care. Fear keeps them silent, but the ember of connection has been lit. Winter came down hard upon the mountains, cloaking every ridge and hollow in white. Snow pressed heavy on the cabin roof, creaked against the beams like a hand trying to pry its way inside. The river froze along its edges, black water hurrying, beneath the crust. Days shortened into quick hours of gray light, and nights stretched long, held together only by fire and silence. Inside, the hearth became their lifeline. The crackle of burning pine filled the void that words could not. She tended the flames with care, feeding logs, brushing away the ash, coaxing life from embers. Elias carried wood in from the shed, each load dusted white, his breath a cloud in the bitter air. He shook the snow from his shoulders before setting the logs down with a dull thud. It was during those nights, when the storm winds clawed at the shutters, that she began to sense how fragile their little world was. Two souls in a fire, holding back the vast cold beyond. And yet, even here, danger found them. The sound came first as crunching in the snow, the measured tread of boots, then voices low, harsh, carrying through the night. She froze at the hearth, the poker clutched in her hand. Elias lifted his head, his jaw tightening as the shadows of men crossed the window. A hard knock rattled the door. "Evenin'," a voice called. "We're looking for a wounded Injun. Heard he come this way. Best you hand him over, old man, if you don't want trouble." Elias moved with steady purpose. He took his rifle from the wall and stepped to the door. His movements were quiet, unhurried, like a man who knew the weight of moments such as this. He opened the door only enough to stand in the frame, his body a barrier against the storm and the strangers. "You'll find no one here," he said, voice deep, even. "And you'll not be welcome hunting blood on my ground." The woman's heart pounded so loudly, she thought the men outside must hear it. She could see them through the narrow gap. 3 figures, rifles slung, faces raw from cold and suspicion. One spat into the snow. "You shelter him, don't you? That breed don't belong in these hills. If he's in there, we'll root him out." Elias's rifle lifted, slow but certain. "Step 1 foot nearer and you'll not take another." Silence fell sharp as the frost between them. The fire inside popped, a single ember leaping. The woman's breath came shallow, her hands trembling. She thought of the graves out back, the broken rocking chair, the wedding dress in the cedar chest, and now this, death waiting at the threshold. The men wavered. They muttered among themselves, curses carried by the wind. One shifted his rifle, but Elias did not flinch. His figure in the doorway was stone unyielding. The cold and his certainty together wore the intruders down. At last the leader spat again and jerked his head. "Not worth the powder," he said. "Keep your silence, old man. Won't be the same next time." They turned, boots crunching, away into the dark. Their voices faded into the storm until nothing remained but the shriek of wind across the eaves. Elias closed the door, slid the bar back into place, and leaned his rifle against the wall. He stood still for a moment, shoulders squared, the weight of threat not yet lifted. Then he turned toward the hearth. She had not moved. The poker still lay in her hand, though she knew it would have been no use. Her chest rose and fell in quick bursts, her eyes bright with fear. And then, without knowing how, the words tumbled out of her, the words that had been lodged inside her since the day her father's wagon left her in this wilderness. I thought. Her voice broke. She tried again. I thought I was given away because I was nothing, because I was shame itself. I've lived every day waiting to be thrown aside again, waiting for you to look at me and see only a burden. The poker slipped from her hand and clattered to the stones. She pressed her palms to her face, but the tears burned through all the same. I was not meant to be kept, she whispered, only discarded. Elias did not answer at once. He moved to the fire, crouched, and laid another log on the flames. Sparks leapt, shadows shifting across the cabin walls. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough, yet steady as a mountain stream under ice. You were not given to me as punishment, he said, not in my eyes. She lowered her hands, her breath caught in her throat. I lost much, he continued, staring into the fire. A wife, a child that never drew breath, the kind of life men build and bury in the same ground. The world left, me hollow. I took silence because it asked nothing of me. Then you came, not by choice, not by kindness, but still you came. And in the space where I thought there would be only duty, there has been something else. He turned his gaze to her then, and in his eyes she saw no pity, no burden, only truth, plain and unvarnished. You are not cast off, not here, not with me. Her tears blurred the firelight, yet warmth spread through her chest, fragile and alive. It was not rescue, not salvation. It was dignity, returned to her in words as steady as his hands. The cabin seemed smaller then, the air nearer, the silence softer. She drew the shawl tighter around her shoulders and sat beside the fire. Elias lowered himself into the chair across from her. The flames between them crackled, painting both their faces with light and shadow. No further words were needed. The truth had been spoken, raw and trembling, but it was enough. The fire burned steady, a symbol not only of survival, but of renewal. In its glow, she realized that she was no longer the discarded daughter of a harsh father, nor merely the shame of an absent lover. Here, in the quiet presence of a man scarred by loss yet still capable of kindness, she had found the faint outline of belonging. It was a fragile thing, no stronger than the flame itself. But like the fire, it could endure, so long as it was tended. Tone and realization, raw and tender, edged with danger but yielding to intimacy. The fire becomes both shield and symbol, illuminating truth long buried. She is not a punishment, and he is not only grief. Together, they recognize the fragile beginning of something worth keeping alive. The thaw came slow. First in the drip of water from the eaves, then in the sudden roar of the river breaking free of its ice. Snow shrank back from the dark earth, revealing shoots of green trembling against the chill. The cabin, once cocooned, by winter, breathed again under skies of pale blue. With spring came labor, and with labor came a new cry that shattered the silence forever. She gripped the edge of the bed, sweat dampening her hair, her body racked with pain deeper than any shame she had known. The old shawl lay beneath her knees, her hands twisted in its fringe. Elias was there, awkward, uncertain, but present. His scarred hands, so accustomed to axe and rifle, now steadied her shoulders and pressed cool cloth to her brow. He spoke, little, but his quiet strength anchored her through the storm of pain. And then, in the dim light of dawn, a child's cry rang through the cabin. Thin, raw, insistent, it pierced the walls, climbed the rafters, reached even the graves outside. She wept at the sound, not only from exhaustion, but from wonder. Elias lifted the small, wriggling body with a care that belied his roughness. He wrapped the child in linen, his large hands trembling as though holding a flame. "Strong lungs," he murmured, placing the baby into her arms. She looked down at the child's face, red and new, and felt something break open in her chest. Not just fear, not just shame. Something greater, a fierce and aching love. And when she raised her eyes to Elias, she saw in him not the cold figure who once stood guard at a door with a rifle, but a man softened by this fragile life. A father, in a way her own had never been. Weeks later, when the earth was firm enough for travel, Elias hitched the wagon. The child, bundled in wool, lay against her breast as they rode toward town. The path felt strange, every turn familiar from memory, yet changed by the weight of what she carried. The town emerged slowly, smoke curling from chimneys, voices rising from porches and streets. As the wagon rattled down the main road, silence spread. Faces turned, whispers hushed. Women gathered their skirts, men narrowed their eyes. She felt shame burn up her throat, hot and suffocating. Old wounds tore open, every whispered word before echoing in her ears, fallen, ruined, cast off. But Elias sat beside her, reins in his hands, posture unbending. His presence was a wall, not loud, not boastful, but immovable. He did not bow to their stares nor urge the horses faster. His calm was its own declaration. Her father stood outside the mercantile. His face was as she remembered it, lined, hard, carved from the same stone as the hills. His eyes flicked from her to the child, then to Elias. No word passed his lips, but the judgment in his gaze weighed heavy. Elias halted the wagon before him. He did not rise, nor did he reach for his rifle. He only looked at the older man, a long, steady look that carried all the force of an oath. His silence was sharper than any speech. "She is not yours to discard. She is under my care, and she has worth." The father's jaw tightened. He shifted once as if to speak, but no words came. At last he turned, retreating into the store, his shadow swallowed by the doorway. The woman's chest trembled, the old hurt flaring even as relief washed through her. She had feared confrontation, feared harsh words, feared being dragged back into the role of shame. But no words had been needed. Elias's presence had been enough. When their errands were done, they turned the wagon homeward. The mountains rose. Before them, snow still clinging to the highest peaks, rivers running wild with meltwater. She held the child close, rocking gently to the rhythm of the wheels. Elias drove with quiet focus, his hands sure, his silence no longer a void but a steady ground on which she could rest. As the town faded behind them, she breathed easier. The shame that had once bound her no longer felt like a chain. She glanced at Elias, at the firm line of his profile, the braid of his hair streaked with silver. She thought of the fire-lit nights, of his words that she was not a punishment, of the way he had held her through birth with more courage than she herself believed she possessed. The child stirred against her, a tiny fist unfurling. She kissed the soft brow, her heart swelling. Then, in the creak of the wagon and the hush of the wind, she understood something new. She had not been abandoned after all. Her father had cast her off, yes, but she was not cast into nothing. She had found in the quiet strength of a scarred man not ownership but a choice, a chance to begin again. The ride stretched on, the mountains opening before them like a promise. The cabin waited, humble yet steadfast, its smoke soon to rise again against the evening sky. She rested her cheek against the baby's head and closed her eyes. What lay ahead would not be easy. The land was harsh, the winters long, the world often unkind. But she was no longer a discarded daughter, nor a shamed girl waiting for rejection.
She was a mother, a woman beside a man who had chosen her not by circumstance but by heart. And for the first time since the day the wagon left her in exile, she felt not like a burden, but like someone going home. Tone and realization, resolute,
Redemptive, deeply emotional. In the cry of the child and the unwavering strength of Elias, she discovers dignity renewed. He finds purpose beyond grief. Together, they ride not into exile, but into chosen life. Proof that the frontier can break and also mend.